Black Hollow was a town that felt like it belonged in another era. Tucked away in the hills, with a small population that lived simple lives, the town was a place where the past seemed to linger in every corner. For years, it had been a quiet place. Too quiet, some might say. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever changed. People lived, worked, and raised families without thinking much about the outside world. The streets were lined with houses that looked like they'd been built a century ago, and the local diner, where the townsfolk gathered every morning, could have been straight out of a 1950s movie. But there was one thing about Black Hollow that no one talked about: the creeping sense that something was always just out of reach. It all began with the disappearances. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A few people simply left town, it seemed. The type of people who always had a wandering heart, or so the townspeople thought. Maybe they were just starting fresh, searching for something better in a world that didn't always offer much. There were rumors that some of the younger folks were trying to escape their quiet lives, that the allure of the city or the open road was just too tempting to resist. And then there were others, people who seemed to vanish into thin air. The more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. A farmer named Ben Harris disappeared one evening without a trace. He was last seen walking to his barn to tend to the animals. His wife, Abigail, waited for him that night, but he never came back. No one knew where he went, and no sign of a struggle was found at the house or the barn. The strangest part was that Ben's boots were still on the front porch the next morning, as if he just stepped out for a moment. But there were no footprints leading away, no evidence to indicate he had gone anywhere. A week later, Carla Simmons, a young mother of two, disappeared. She had been getting groceries when she'd vanished from the corner store. Her car was still parked outside, the bags of groceries on the passenger seat. The security cameras in the parking lot had caught footage of her entering the store, but when they checked the footage again hours later, she was gone. Just like that. And then there was Marcus Shaw, the local teacher. He had been known for his kindness and the way he devoted his life to his students. He had a quiet, humble way about him. His disappearance shook the town to its core. Marcus had been on a late-night walk, his favorite ritual after a long day of teaching. His wife said he had kissed her goodnight and told her he would be back soon. That night, he never returned. His shoes were found by the park, and the rest of him, along with any answers, was gone. The disappearances were unsettling at first, but the town tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. People whispered, sure. The sheriff's department investigated, but the cases seemed to go nowhere. There were theories, of course. Maybe a stranger was behind it, or perhaps the missing had just decided to leave. But as the weeks went on, something darker began to take shape. And then came the whispers about the woods. The woods had always been there, looming just beyond the town's border, dense and mysterious. Locals had always avoided venturing too deep into them, not because they were particularly dangerous, but because they were strange. There were stories, of course. Old tales passed down through generations of strange happenings and eerie noises that came from the trees on quiet nights. Most of the stories were dismissed as local legends, fairy tales meant to keep children from wandering too far from home. But with each disappearance, the stories began to take on a more unsettling tone. Some said that the woods were cursed, that something was hiding within them, something ancient and terrible. Others claimed that the forest was the home of restless spirits, souls trapped between worlds, waiting to drag the living into their realm. Most folks didn't put much stock in these stories, but when the disappearances continued, the unease began to seep into every conversation. Emma didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but the more she dug into the history of Black Hollow, the more she realized that there was something in the air, a tension that couldn't be ignored. There was a thread connecting the disappearances, and it seemed to be pointing her toward the woods. It was on a cool autumn evening, after a long day of interviews, that Emma found herself standing outside Nora's house. The wind had picked up, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and fallen leaves. She hadn't planned to come back here, but something had drawn her to it. The house was eerily quiet, the lights dimmed, the windows dark. It felt as though the entire town had gone to sleep, as though Black Hollow was holding its breath. Emma glanced up at the window to Nora's attic. The house was old, and the attic had been unused for years. But tonight, as Emma stood there, she saw it, the faintest flicker of light in the window. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen anyone come in or out of the house all day. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The house seemed to be holding its secrets close. Emma was about to turn away when she heard it, a faint, distant sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then it came again. A high-pitched scream, distant yet unmistakable. The kind of scream that sent chills down your spine. The kind of scream that seemed to echo through the very core of the earth. Emma's blood ran cold. The scream came from the woods. She turned and sprinted toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. Something was wrong. Black Hollow was changing before her eyes, and she wasn't sure she could stop it. The scream echoed again, and for the first time in her life, Emma felt truly afraid. She didn't know what awaited her in the woods, but she knew one thing for sure: she had to find out. And as she ran toward the darkness, she couldn't help but wonder, was she too late? The deeper Emma ventured into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees towered over her like silent sentinels, their branches twisting together in a thick canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The ground beneath her feet was damp and uneven, each step a challenge as she pushed forward through the underbrush. Her breath was ragged, each exhale visible in the cold air, but she didn't slow down. She had to find the source of that scream, the one that had haunted her the moment she heard it. It was a call for help, she was sure of it. But as she pushed further, something began to feel wrong. There was an unnatural stillness around her, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, were absent, leaving only the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. The scream came again, this time louder, more desperate. It sent a chill straight through her body, paralyzing her for a moment. The voice was unmistakable. There was no mistaking it. It was human, but distorted, as if it had been stretched through some unnatural lens of fear and pain. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard before. "Who's there?" Emma called out, her voice breaking the silence. It was a feeble attempt to make her presence known, but it felt insignificant against the vastness of the woods. The scream continued, echoing off the trees like a warning. It sounded like it was coming from the heart of the forest, deep within a grove she had never seen before, a place no one had dared venture. Despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back, Emma pressed on, her legs aching from the strain. Her flashlight cut through the dark, its beam quivering slightly in her hand. She could feel the temperature dropping, the air growing heavier with each step. The woods had a way of swallowing sound, but tonight, it seemed as though the very air was charged with tension. She reached a clearing, and for a moment, she thought she had found the source of the scream. But the clearing was empty. There was no one here, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. It was then that she noticed something strange. In the center of the clearing, a pile of old, rotting leaves had been disturbed, as if something, or someone, had been here recently. The leaves were scattered in a haphazard pattern, and they seemed to form a rough circle around a jagged, dark stone in the middle. The stone was weathered, its surface covered in moss and lichen, but there was something about it that made Emma uneasy. As she moved closer, her foot caught on something buried in the ground. She bent down to inspect it and froze. There, half covered in dirt and leaves, was a small, weathered wooden box. It was almost as if it had been deliberately hidden, as though it didn't belong. Her pulse quickened as she reached for it. Something inside her told her to leave it alone, to walk away and never look back. But curiosity gnawed at her. With trembling hands, Emma pulled the box from the ground. The wood was rough, the edges worn down by time. She flipped it open cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at her. Inside, instead of a treasure or some lost relic, she found something far more disturbing. A collection of small, dried flowers, each one twisted and knotted together. The flowers were of various colors, but they were all darkened, as if they had been stained by something. Emma's stomach churned at the sight of them. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone bury flowers in the middle of the woods? Then, as her eyes lingered on the box, she noticed something else. A faint marking on the underside of the lid. It was difficult to make out in the weak light, but she could see it was some sort of symbol carved deep into the wood. It was a twisted, jagged shape, almost like a runic pattern. She didn't recognize it, but it looked ancient, like something that belonged to a time long before Black Hollow had been settled. Suddenly, she heard it again. The scream. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind her. Emma's heart stopped. She spun around, her flashlight scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing in on her. She had the unsettling feeling that the forest itself was closing in, trapping her. A figure emerged from the trees, slowly at first, then with an unnatural, jerky movement. It was a person. At least, it looked like one. But something about the figure was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body unnaturally thin, and its movements were stiff, like it was struggling to maintain control over its own form. The face was obscured, hidden beneath a tangle of black hair that seemed to move with a life of its own. Emma took a step back, her hand tightening around the flashlight. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but it was drawing closer. The air grew colder, the very presence of the thing pressing on her chest. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Was this one of the missing townsfolk? Had they come back? Or was it something else entirely? Something from the woods, something that had been lying in wait? The figure reached out, its hand twitching erratically. In the dim light, Emma could see that the fingers were elongated, twisted at odd angles. Its hand was covered in dirt, as though it had been digging, perhaps even burying the very box she had found. It reached toward her, and Emma instinctively took a step back. Before she could react further, the figure stopped. It tilted its head to the side, its hair falling away slightly to reveal a pale, hollow face, devoid of any expression. The eyes, though, were wide and glassy, staring at her with an intensity that sent a wave of nausea through her. A whisper filled the air, a voice that wasn't quite a voice. It was more like a feeling, something that pressed into her skull, urging her to understand. You should not have come. The words were not spoken aloud, but felt in the very marrow of her bones. The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old. It was timeless, filled with an ancient sorrow. Emma's heart raced as panic began to claw at her. She turned to run, but as she did, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The trees around her creaked and groaned, as though they were alive, their branches swaying in a rhythmic motion, reaching for her. The figure didn't move, but Emma could feel its presence as though it were right behind her, breathing down her neck. She couldn't afford to look back. She had to keep moving, keep running, but no matter how fast she went, the woods seemed endless. It was as though she was running in circles, her body betraying her, her mind clouded with fear. Finally, after what felt like hours of running through the forest, Emma stumbled into the clearing again. She was breathless, disoriented, and covered in sweat. The figure was gone, but the feeling of its presence lingered, a weight pressing on her chest. But then she saw it. The stone in the center of the clearing had changed. The jagged edges that once seemed harmless were now sharper, darker. It was as if the stone had been waiting for her, drawing her back here, a silent marker of something terrible. Something she couldn't yet understand. As Emma stood there, her pulse still hammering in her chest, she realized one terrible truth. She was not just running from something. She was being hunted. And the woods knew it. Emma's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. She was exhausted, but more than that, she was terrified. The woods had swallowed her whole, and no matter how far she ran, it felt like they were pulling her deeper into their sinister grasp. The figure she had seen, if it could even be called a figure, wasn't just a random traveler lost in the forest. It was something darker, something that belonged to this place. A part of it, perhaps. Emma didn't know, but she knew one thing. She needed to get out. She backed away from the stone, her eyes still darting around the clearing. Her body was shaking, but she had to remain calm. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The air was unnaturally still, the silence hanging heavy over the woods. She had to focus, find a way out before whatever was hunting her found her first. The moon had shifted overhead, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Emma turned, ready to flee, but something caught her eye. There, at the edge of the clearing, was a shadowy figure. It wasn't the same one she had seen earlier. This one was smaller, hunched over, its outline barely visible in the darkness. It didn't move, but Emma could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding. Her heart skipped a beat as she took a step back, every fiber of her being screaming at her to run. But something held her in place, like an invisible force had rooted her to the ground. She wanted to call out, to scream for help, but her voice caught in her throat. Her instincts were telling her that any noise would only make things worse. The figure remained motionless, like a shadow in the night, and Emma was beginning to wonder if it was real or if it was some trick her mind was playing on her. But then it moved, just a slight shift of its head, and suddenly Emma could see its eyes. They weren't human. They glowed, an eerie shade of yellow, like the eyes of a predator stalking its prey. Emma's blood ran cold as the figure's eyes locked onto hers. A chill crawled down her spine, and she instinctively took another step back, her feet now stumbling over the uneven ground. The shadow didn't follow. Instead, it disappeared into the trees, blending seamlessly with the darkness. Emma waited, her breath shallow, her heart thudding in her chest. She hadn't imagined it. That thing had been real. And it was watching her. For what felt like an eternity, Emma stood frozen in the clearing, her senses on high alert. Every rustling leaf, every whisper of wind felt like it was closing in on her. Her mind spun, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. She had to leave, now. Whatever was lurking in the woods was not something she could fight. It was something ancient, something that had lived here long before she ever set foot in Black Hollow. Turning her back on the stone, Emma finally found her legs again and sprinted toward the edge of the clearing. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps, and her feet slipped on the wet earth, but she didn't stop. She didn't dare. The woods seemed to close in on her as she ran, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. The trees loomed like dark giants, their twisted branches reaching down as if they were trying to trap her. She kept her eyes ahead, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand as she cut through the underbrush. And then, she heard it again, the scream. This time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't echoing from deep within the forest. It was right behind her. Emma's blood ran cold. Her legs were already aching, but the fear pushing her forward was enough to make her run faster. The scream was followed by something else, a faint, rhythmic sound like footsteps dragging behind her. She didn't dare turn around, knowing that whatever was following her was closer than ever. The forest was disorienting. Every tree looked the same. Every path led to another dead end. Emma had no idea where she was going. She only knew she had to keep moving, had to outrun whatever was chasing her. But as she ran, she couldn't shake the feeling that the very earth beneath her feet was shifting. The path was no longer the same. She had been here before, but it looked different now. The trees were closer together, the shadows darker. It was as if the forest was rearranging itself to trap her, leading her deeper into its heart. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root that had risen from the ground like a twisted claw. Emma fell forward, catching herself just before her face hit the ground. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, but before she could take another step, the scream came again, louder, sharper, filled with agony. She spun around, and this time, there was no denying it. The figure was there. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, its form now more distinct. The dark shape of it was no longer a blur. It was tall and thin, its body almost skeletal, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was watching her, its head tilting as if it were studying her every move. "Who are you?" Emma screamed, her voice hoarse and frantic. She wasn't sure if the figure could even hear her, but she had to try. There had to be a reason behind all of this. She just needed to know what it was. The figure didn't respond. It simply stared at her, unblinking, its yellow eyes reflecting a strange hunger. And then, without a word, it took a step forward. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she turned and bolted again. This time, she didn't look back. She didn't dare. The scream echoed through the woods, a piercing, soul-crushing sound that made Emma's blood run cold. It was so close now, too close. The ground seemed to rise and fall beneath her feet, as though the very earth was trying to swallow her. The trees closed in tighter, their branches twisting like fingers reaching out to drag her down. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. Emma didn't dare slow down. She kept running, the fear and exhaustion pushing her forward. Her legs burned, her lungs felt like they were on fire, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she knew that something was waiting for her, lurking in the darkness. And then, without warning, everything went silent. The air grew thick, and the forest around her seemed to hold its breath. Emma froze in place, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt it, an overwhelming pressure that filled the air. The woods had stopped making noise. The trees stood perfectly still. The scream had vanished, but something else was there, something far worse. She slowly turned, her eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. But the woods were empty. For the first time since she had entered the forest, there was no sound, no movement. But Emma knew, whatever had been following her was still here, waiting. And it was far worse than she could ever imagine. Emma's feet dragged through the damp forest floor, her breath sharp and ragged. The silence that enveloped her was suffocating, far more terrifying than the screams and the sounds that had tormented her before. She felt a strange, almost oppressive weight in the air, as though something unseen was pressing in on her from all sides. The eerie stillness was far too unnatural. There should have been rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, but there was nothing. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat loud in the unnatural quiet. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but the darkness behind her remained empty. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches hanging overhead, blocking out the moonlight. But Emma knew better than to believe in the illusion of safety. She had learned that much in the last few hours. The forest was alive in a way she couldn't understand, its shadows shifting and stretching like they had a mind of their own. She could feel it, a presence, watching, waiting. With every step, the panic in her chest tightened, and she couldn't decide whether it was the fear of what might be lurking in the shadows or the growing sense that the forest itself was beginning to change. The trees were no longer just trees. They seemed to be bending in closer, their gnarled trunks twisting and contorting, as if they were reaching for her, guiding her towards something. Or perhaps trapping her. The air grew colder as she walked, her breath now visible in the moonlight. She hugged her arms to her chest, the chill of the night sinking deep into her bones. Her feet were sore, the constant running and stumbling wearing her down, but she had to keep moving. The forest had to end somewhere, right? There had to be a way out. But as she pushed forward, she realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching realization that she had stopped recognizing the path. The trees, which once appeared to form a clear route through the woods, now seemed to have merged into a labyrinth. Everything looked the same, like a never-ending sea of shadows. She had been running in circles. She stopped, her breath ragged and strained, and looked around, desperately trying to find some sign that she wasn't completely lost. But the forest had swallowed her whole. She was no longer sure if she was even on the right trail anymore, or if it was even the same path she had started on. Her panic surged again, but this time it was different. Something inside her told her that it didn't matter where she went. The forest wasn't going to let her leave. She was trapped. A rustling sound broke through the silence, sharp and distinct. Emma froze, her body rigid with fear. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes darting around, trying to find the source of the noise. It came from the trees. There, a flash of movement in the shadows. Something, or someone, was out there. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as the figure emerged from the darkness, tall and impossibly thin, its shape too unnaturally long. It was humanoid, but its limbs stretched and bent in grotesque angles, as if they didn't belong to the same body. It moved with a jerky, unsettling grace, its body twisting in ways that were beyond the human experience. The thing stepped forward, its face hidden in the shadows of the hood it wore. The only thing visible were its eyes, those haunting, glowing yellow eyes that pierced through the darkness. They were fixed on her, unwavering, cold, and full of hunger. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Emma felt a knot of dread form deep in her stomach. She was too afraid to run, too afraid to even scream. Her legs were frozen in place, her mind screaming for her to move, to fight, to do something. Anything. Then the figure spoke. Run. It rasped, its voice thin and warped, as if it had been distorted by years of disuse. The word echoed in Emma's mind, sending a shiver down her spine. Run? Was it giving her permission? Or was it something worse? An order? A taunt? A game? She had no idea, but the urgency in the voice was enough to snap her out of her paralysis. Without thinking, Emma turned and bolted, her feet pounding against the forest floor as she fled. The figure didn't follow immediately, but she could feel its presence behind her, drawing closer with each step. She didn't dare look back. If she did, she knew she would lose what little hope she had left. The trees blurred around her as she pushed herself harder, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, any plan. But there was nothing. The forest was closing in on her, and no matter how fast she ran, it was like the darkness was always one step ahead. Another scream, sharp and terrifying, ripped through the night, coming from behind her, though it felt as though it was coming from all around her. It was no longer just a scream of pain, but something more, something primal, something that spoke of ancient, insatiable hunger. Emma stumbled, her foot catching on a root as she fell forward. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She tried to push herself up, but the world spun around her. Her head was spinning, her body was shaking, and the pain in her side from the fall only added to the growing terror. She scrambled to her feet, her legs weak beneath her, but as she took another step, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. In that moment, something inside her snapped. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something more raw, more desperate. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't escape. But maybe, just maybe, she could face it. Emma whipped around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could barely make out the figure now, but she could feel its eyes on her, feel the weight of its gaze. The air was thick with tension, like something was about to break. And then, with a sudden, deafening silence, the figure stopped. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. For a moment, everything stood still. The air felt heavy, as if the very forest were holding its breath. Emma didn't know what was happening. She didn't understand what this thing wanted from her. But one thing was clear: she couldn't keep running forever. The only choice she had left was to face whatever this was. And so, with every ounce of courage she could muster, she stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. And the figure finally moved. It wasn't a quick movement, but a deliberate one, slow and purposeful, as if savoring the moment. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and twist with its every step, distorting the air like the atmosphere itself was warping under its presence. Emma didn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the figure. The longer she stared, the more it felt like the world around her was fading, like there was nothing left but her and this thing that had haunted her since she first set foot in these cursed woods. It was now or never. And as the creature drew closer, Emma whispered one word to herself: survive. The figure was nearly upon her now, its eyes glowing brighter as it closed the distance between them. Each step it took seemed to make the air grow colder, heavier. The moonlight flickered, dimming as though even the night itself was afraid of the entity in front of her. Emma's legs felt like lead, frozen in place by the weight of terror that pressed down on her chest. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat, threatening to choke her with each beat. She wanted to move, to run, but the fear had paralyzed her. The creature's presence felt like a dark cloud, closing in, suffocating her. As the thing stopped just a few feet away, Emma could see it more clearly now. Its features were still mostly hidden in the shadows, but she could make out its gaunt, elongated face, the sharp angles of its jaw, and the hollow, deep-set eyes that glowed with an unnatural yellow light. Its skin was almost translucent, stretched too tight over its bones. Its body seemed to be more shadow than flesh, with limbs too long and thin to be human. Emma's breath caught in her throat as it tilted its head, examining her with a kind of curiosity, as if trying to understand what she was. Its mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out at first. Then it spoke, its voice low and eerie, vibrating with a tone that felt as if it came from deep within the earth. "You're not like the others," it rasped, its voice grating and unnatural. Emma's mind raced, trying to process its words. The others? Who else was it talking about? She hadn't seen anyone else in the woods. Hadn't heard anyone else's screams, except for her own. The darkness was thick and oppressive around them, the forest closing in even further, as if it were drawing them both into a single moment of time. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign to her, like they weren't her own. The question lingered in the cold air, heavy and unanswered. The creature's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Emma thought she saw something like amusement in them, though she couldn't be sure. It stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding through the air. The shadows around it seemed to writhe and twist with each motion. The temperature around her dropped even further, until her breath came out in white puffs, freezing in the night air. You are here because you were chosen," it said, its voice slithering through the silence like a snake. "You have heard the call, Emma. You are bound to it, just like the rest." Emma blinked, confusion flooding her thoughts. "The call?" she asked, her voice trembling. The creature's form seemed to stretch, its thin body elongating even further, almost unnatural in its fluidity. "The call of the scream," it replied, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. Its lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth that seemed to gleam in the dim light. "The scream?" Emma repeated, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "What do you mean by the scream?" It took another step toward her, its thin fingers outstretched. It was so close now, close enough that Emma could feel its cold breath on her skin, sharp like ice. Her heart raced, her pulse roaring in her ears as she backed away instinctively. The thing's gaze remained fixed on her, its expression unreadable, yet somehow knowing. "The scream that never ends," it whispered, its voice now barely audible, like a hiss in the wind. "The scream that haunts every corner of the earth. It lives within the shadows, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. And now, you are a part of it." Emma's stomach churned. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. What was it talking about? How was she a part of something so dark, so horrific? But even as the questions swirled in her mind, she felt it, the pull, the invisible force drawing her closer to the creature. She tried to fight it, to resist, but it was as if her body was betraying her, like she was being dragged into its grip against her will. "No," she whispered, shaking her head desperately, trying to step back. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for any of this." The creature's smile widened, stretching across its face in a grotesque parody of joy. "None of us asked for it, Emma. But we are all chosen in the end. The scream, it calls to us all." It raised its hand, and for a moment, Emma thought it was going to touch her, to drag her into whatever nightmare it had come from. But then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The smile faded, and the creature's face became a mask of quiet intensity. "It is not your fate to fight it," it said. "It is your fate to hear it, to become it." A sudden shock of fear coursed through Emma, more powerful than anything she had ever felt before. Her mind raced, the words tumbling over each other in her brain. "Become it?" she repeated in disbelief. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" The creature tilted its head, as though contemplating her response, before its mouth opened wide. Its voice echoed out, deep and resonant, vibrating the very air around them. "The scream is eternal. It cannot be silenced. It lives in those who are chosen, and it will always find a way to be heard." The forest around Emma seemed to close in even further, the trees now pressing in on all sides. The shadows around her grew darker, swirling like smoke as if they were alive. She could feel the weight of the creature's words, wrapping themselves around her like chains. There was no escape, no way out. The creature's face was now impossibly close to hers, its eyes boring into hers with a predatory gaze. The yellow light in its eyes flickered, and Emma's mind began to spin, as if it were being overwhelmed by the intensity of its presence. "You are the next," it said softly, its voice carrying a note of finality. "Your scream will join the others. It will become part of the eternal chorus that haunts the living, the dying, and the forgotten." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The horror of its words washed over her like a wave, drowning her in terror. She could feel her throat tightening, as though the scream itself was trying to claw its way out of her, trying to force its way into the world. She didn't want it. She didn't want any of this. But the pull of the creature, the pull of the scream, was undeniable. She opened her mouth to scream, to fight, to cry out for help. But before the sound could leave her lips, the world around her cracked open. The ground beneath her feet seemed to give way, and the trees above her seemed to twist and bend into impossible shapes. Everything blurred and distorted, the shadows merging with the light until there was nothing left but a void, an endless blackness. And then there was a scream. Her scream. The final scream in the night. The darkness was absolute, like a thick blanket smothering every last vestige of light. Emma's mind was racing, every thought a jumbled mess of panic and confusion. The echo of her scream still reverberated in her ears, an almost tangible presence in the emptiness that surrounded her. She tried to move, to find her bearings, but her limbs felt heavy, like they were trapped beneath something suffocating. A cold chill ran through her, biting at her skin, as though the very air she breathed was laced with frost. She couldn't see anything. No trees, no ground, no creatures, just an overwhelming, oppressive void. For a moment, Emma thought she had died. That somehow, the terror had consumed her entirely, and this was the space between life and death. But then, faintly, she heard a sound, far off in the distance. It was the same sound that had followed her since the beginning. A scream. It echoed through the void, distant yet hauntingly familiar. It was the same scream she had just uttered. The one that had torn through the night, a cry that had marked her as chosen. But there was something different about it now. The scream was growing louder, closer, as if it were moving toward her, seeking her out. It was almost as though it had a life of its own, like it was alive and hungry. Her heart began to race again, pounding in her chest like a wild animal trying to escape. What was happening? What was this place? Why was that scream coming for her? Emma? A voice. The voice wasn't from the creature. It wasn't from the shadows. It was something else, something human. But it was weak, strained, almost as if it had traveled through miles of darkness to reach her ears. Emma, please. Her name again. The voice was soft, but desperate. She strained to hear it, trying to focus on its source, but it seemed to come from every direction, a whisper in the void. Emma, you have to wake up. You have to escape. Her breath caught in her throat. Escape. How was she supposed to escape from a place that didn't even seem to exist? A place so dark and consuming that even her thoughts felt lost in the void. Who's there? She whispered, her voice shaking as she tried to call out into the emptiness. A figure emerged slowly from the shadows, something human, but wrong. It was a shape, a silhouette that twisted and morphed as it approached her. At first, it was indistinguishable, just a blur of motion, but as it came closer, Emma saw that it was a man. But it wasn't just any man. This figure had pale, lifeless skin, and its eyes were wide, unblinking, as though it were trapped in some unearthly stare. There was no emotion in its face, just an eerie calm. Its hands were outstretched, fingers long and claw-like, reaching toward her as it moved through the dark like a phantom. Help me, the figure rasped. Its voice was hoarse, like it had been crying for far too long, and now its words were barely more than a whisper. Help them. Who are you? Emma's voice cracked, fear flooding through her once more. What is this place? Where am I? The scream echoed through the darkness, piercing the silence like a blade cutting through flesh. It was raw, unfiltered, a sound of absolute terror and despair. And then it stopped. The void fell back into a chilling stillness, as if it had absorbed the last remnants of Emma's scream into its unrelenting depths. But Emma. She was still there, or at least she thought she was. Her body felt strange, numb, yet alive with an unnatural energy. Her mind was a mess of swirling thoughts and emotions, struggling to comprehend the inexplicable. She had screamed, yes. She had become part of whatever this cursed place was. But now, in the aftermath, something had shifted. She wasn't sure if it was the scream itself, the force of it, or something else, but there was a profound sense of change, as if something had broken free within her. At first, she couldn't see anything. Her vision was still clouded, as if a veil of smoke or mist had settled over her eyes. But slowly, very slowly, it began to clear, revealing nothing. There was no landscape, no shape, no structure around her. The void stretched endlessly, as far as her eyes could see. It was as if she was standing on the edge of an abyss, looking into an endless ocean of emptiness. And then, out of the dark, something moved. A figure. It was human, or at least it appeared to be. At first, Emma thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind. But no, there it was, coming toward her. Slowly, methodically, as though it knew exactly where she was. As it moved closer, Emma could see more details. Its shape was slightly distorted, twisted, as though it didn't quite belong in this space. The figure stepped forward, its body flickering like a reflection on water, rippling with a ghostly glow. And then, it spoke. Emma. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard before, the voice of the figure from earlier, the one who had warned her about the curse. But now there was something different about it. Something more desperate, more pleading. She turned to face it fully, her breath catching in her throat as the figure's shape became clearer. This time, it was no longer a shadow. It was a man, but not entirely human. His features were familiar, but distorted. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull, and his skin had a sickly pallor, stretched tight over bones. His hands were long and gnarled, his fingers twitching like they were trying to grasp something just out of reach. "Who? What are you?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. Her mind was struggling to make sense of the impossible situation, but fear and confusion clouded her every thought. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body felt like it was rooted to the spot. The figure took another step closer, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. "I am the one who screams," he rasped, his voice a tortured whisper that made Emma's skin crawl. "And now, so are you." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to scream in response, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. It was as if the scream had taken all of her voice, leaving her empty, voiceless. "The curse is upon you now, Emma," the figure continued, his voice growing weaker, more strained. "It cannot be undone. You are trapped in this void, in this eternal silence. You will scream again and again, but it will never be enough. Never loud enough to break free." Emma tried to speak, but no sound came. Her throat was dry, her mouth parched, as though the scream had drained her entirely. She felt a rising panic, the walls of the void closing in on her, suffocating her. The figure's face twisted in something like a grimace, his eyes now filled with a desperate, burning intensity. "You think you can escape?" he hissed. "You think you can run? No one escapes this place. The final scream is the beginning, not the end. You've only just begun." Emma stumbled backward, her feet slipping against the dark ground that seemed to shift beneath her. She was trapped. Trapped in a world that defied reason, a world that no one could understand. The reality of it all was too much to process. "No," she whispered. "This can't be real. This has to be a nightmare." But deep down, Emma knew the truth. This wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't something her mind had conjured up in a panic. This was real. This was happening. The figure smiled, or at least, Emma thought it was a smile. It was more of a grotesque curl of his lips, something twisted and unnatural. "Welcome to the endless scream, Emma," he whispered, his voice dripping with sorrow and menace. "Welcome to your fate." And then, just as quickly as the figure had appeared, he was gone, vanishing into the void like smoke carried on a breeze. Emma stood there, frozen, unable to move or react. She had no idea how much time passed. Seconds, minutes, hours. Everything felt disjointed, like time had lost its meaning. And then, out of the corner of her eye, something shifted again. Another figure, another presence in the dark. Emma turned, her heart racing in her chest. This time, it wasn't a man. It was something else, something darker, something that felt wrong. The creature, if it could even be called that, was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its body was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long, with skin that seemed to ripple and change like liquid shadows. Its face was a grotesque mask of darkness, its eyes two hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to send Emma's mind spiraling into a frenzy of terror. The figure stretched its arms out toward her, its fingers reaching like claws, and Emma knew, deep within her bones, that it wasn't just here to watch. It was here to take her scream. Before she could react, before she could run, the figure lunged forward, its long arms snaking around her like ropes, binding her in an iron grip. The coldness of its touch sent shockwaves of dread through her body. as though its very touch was draining the life from her. Emma opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The creature's grip tightened, and the darkness seemed to close in around her. She could feel it now, the weight of the curse, the weight of the scream that had been passed down to her. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was an entity, a force, something alive and relentless. And it was hungry. As the creature's grip tightened around her, the final scream echoed in her mind. And for the first time, Emma understood the true meaning of the curse. It was endless. Emma was suspended in a strange, oppressive silence. The world around her had collapsed into darkness once more. Her heart pounded in her chest, the only sound in the void. She could no longer feel the presence of the creature, but it was as though its chilling grip still lingered, tightening around her very soul. Her breath quickened, shallow and desperate, as her mind struggled to find some way to break free. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no escape. The void was unyielding, a realm that defied reason and comprehension. No matter how much she willed herself to wake up, no matter how fiercely she fought the fear that was growing inside of her, she couldn't break free. The curse was inescapable. The final scream had already been unleashed, and now, Emma had become part of it, a mere thread in the endless tapestry of pain and suffering that spanned across this twisted dimension. She could feel it now, an overwhelming pressure, a sensation of being watched. Not by just one presence, but by many. Hundreds, thousands of unseen eyes, all fixed upon her, waiting. She wasn't alone in this place, and that thought made her skin crawl. A low, guttural sound rose from the dark. It wasn't a voice this time, but something far worse, something primal, something that belonged to the void itself. Emma spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing in sight. The silence was broken only by the low, growling hum that reverberated through the very air around her, sending waves of dread coursing through her veins. Then the figure appeared again. It had no shape, no form that she could discern, just a swirling, shifting mass of darkness. Emma's knees buckled beneath her, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her throat was dry, her heart pounding in her chest as she struggled to breathe. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but all she could do was stare into the empty abyss. The figure hovered before her, its shape pulsating with an unsettling rhythm. The void around it seemed to ripple as it twisted and morphed, like smoke curling in the wind. And then it spoke. "Emma," the voice echoed, a distorted whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You think this is your end?" Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. "Who are you?" Emma choked out, her voice a faint rasp. "What do you want from me?" The figure's presence grew stronger, pressing down on her with an unbearable weight. It spoke again, but this time, its voice was different, softer, more familiar. It was the voice of someone she knew, someone she loved. "Do you remember me, Emma?" Her breath hitched in her throat. The voice, it was her mother's voice. "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, you're not her." The figure's shape shifted again, and for a moment, the darkness seemed to recede, revealing a silhouette. A woman, standing in front of her. Emma's heart lurched in her chest. The figure was no longer a mass of darkness, but now took the form of her mother, her features twisted, contorted, as though someone had tried to make her look human, but had failed horribly. Her eyes were hollow, black, and her lips stretched in a grotesque, empty smile. "I am what you've become, Emma," the voice whispered. "I am your past, your future, your curse. There is no escape from the scream. You are bound to it now, forever." "No," Emma cried, shaking her head. "You're not her. You're not my mother. What do you want from me?" The woman, if it could even be called that, took a step forward, her shadowy form flickering like a broken reflection in a shattered mirror. "I want you to understand," the figure said softly, almost soothingly. I want you to accept it. Accept that you are part of something much greater than yourself now. Emma stepped back, her body trembling, the tears running down her face. The figure before her stretched out one long skeletal hand. The scream is endless, Emma, it murmured, its voice like a cold wind. You cannot outrun it. You cannot hide. It will follow you, no matter where you go. Emma's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, her heart racing in her chest. The figure, the voice, everything about it felt wrong. Her mother was dead. She had seen her body, her lifeless form. This thing in front of her, this monstrous apparition, could not be her. But somehow, the presence felt familiar, like a reflection of a part of her she couldn't quite place. The figure continued to speak, its voice now turning into a low growl. The curse is in your blood, Emma. It's in all of us. It lives within us, feeding off our fear, our pain. The final scream is not an ending. It is a beginning. A calling. And you, Emma, are the next in line. Shut up, Emma screamed, the words tearing out of her throat as she stumbled backward, her eyes wide with panic. I won't do it. I won't be part of this. But the figure's gaze never wavered. You already are, Emma, it said softly. There is no escaping it. You will scream, and the world will hear you. And when they do, they will join you in the void. The final scream is the last thing they'll ever hear. The words sent a cold shiver down her spine, and for a brief moment, she felt a weight in her chest. The fear that had been building inside of her for so long, the terror that she had been unable to control, suddenly seemed to take on a life of its own. She could feel it, crawling beneath her skin, urging her to scream, to give in, to let the fear consume her. And then, without warning, the figure lunged forward, its arms reaching out to grab her, its fingers long and skeletal. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to move, to get away, but her limbs felt like they were frozen in place. The darkness closed in around her again, and the sound of her breath, shallow and panicked, was the only thing that filled the void. But before it could reach her, there was a sudden, blinding flash of light. Emma blinked, her mind disoriented, and when she opened her eyes again, the figure was gone. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the oppressive, suffocating silence she had been drowning in. It was lighter. The air seemed less thick. Emma dared to hope, just for a moment, that she had escaped. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. She had been marked. The final scream had already begun. And there was no going back. The air felt colder now, the light around Emma dim and hazy as she took slow, uncertain steps forward. Her pulse still raced from the encounter with the figure. Her mother's twisted form, the chilling words that had come from it, echoing in her mind. She had tried to convince herself that it was just a hallucination, some nightmare born of her deepest fears, but the weight of the experience settled heavily in her bones. It wasn't just her imagination. The curse was real. The scream was real. She could still hear it, faintly, in the back of her mind. The echo of pain, the call of torment. Her feet dragged along the cold floor as she moved through the dark, searching for something. Anything that could help her make sense of what was happening. The darkness that surrounded her seemed to shift and twist, as though it was alive, watching her every movement, waiting for the moment when she would break. A faint whisper reached her ears, too quiet to understand, but loud enough to send a shiver down her spine. It was the same voice from before, the one that had spoken through the figure, her mother's distorted voice. You can't hide, Emma, it hissed softly, a cruel laugh following it. You will never escape. Emma's breath hitched, and she clenched her fists, trying to steady her nerves. She needed to stay calm. She needed to figure out how to fight back, how to break free from whatever twisted nightmare she had been dragged into. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had no control here. This was not a world she understood, not a place where rules applied. It was a realm of suffering, a liminal space where time and reality bent and warped to something darker. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but no one was there. The hallway stretched out endlessly in both directions, a corridor of shadows and cold light. She could feel it now, the weight of the silence pressing down on her, almost suffocating her. And then she heard it again, the scream. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A horrible, guttural wail of agony that tore through the silence like a blade. The scream that had haunted her since the moment she first heard it. Emma's chest tightened, and for a moment, she thought she might suffocate, the sound itself growing louder, more insistent. She had to get out of here. She had to find a way to escape the clutches of this place, this nightmare that had become her reality. Her feet moved faster now, her body propelled by sheer instinct, a primal urge to run. But no matter how fast she moved, no matter how much distance she tried to put between herself and the source of the scream, it was always there. It lingered in the corners of her mind, curling like smoke in the air, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Emma's breath quickened, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Her eyes darted from side to side, searching for an exit, but the dark corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls closing in around her. There was no escape. There was nowhere to hide. The scream was everywhere. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, the figure appeared again. This time, standing at the far end of the corridor, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was the same shape as before, a swirling mass of darkness, but now there was something different. A presence. An energy that seemed to pulse and shift with every breath she took. Emma, the voice whispered, the sound impossibly loud, as if it came from all directions at once. You cannot outrun this. You cannot escape the final scream. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she stared at the figure, her body frozen in place, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was something else. Something more sinister. She could feel it, the energy emanating from it, and for the first time, Emma felt truly helpless. The figure began to move toward her, its dark tendrils reaching out, twisting and writhing as if alive. Her feet remained rooted to the ground, her body paralyzed by fear. The darkness seemed to consume everything around her, swallowing up the light, the air, the very sound of her heartbeat. Why? Emma managed to whisper, her voice shaking with terror. Why are you doing this to me? What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer. It only grew closer, its shape becoming clearer, more defined. Emma could see the face now, or what was left of it. A twisted, mangled version of her mother's face stared back at her, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. The mouth stretched open, forming words that Emma couldn't hear, only feel, as if the words themselves were being etched into her very being. The air grew colder still, the darkness tightening its grip around her, suffocating her. And then, she heard the scream again. Louder this time, closer. It was coming from all around her, reverberating through her skull. The scream of someone trapped, someone in agony. And Emma knew, without a doubt, that it was her. Her scream, the final scream. Suddenly, the world shifted, and Emma was no longer standing in the corridor. She was back in that room, the room from before, the one with the monitors and the black tape. The tape with the word Wilhelm scrawled across it. She could still hear the voice, still feel the presence of the figure, but now it was distant, fading, as if it were all just a memory. A fading nightmare. But that was when she saw it, the final piece of the puzzle. On the monitor in front of her, the screen flickered to life. The tape was playing again, the same grainy black and white footage from before. She could see the man, bound to the chair, his face twisted in pain. She could hear the faint sounds of the voice behind the camera, urging him to scream. But now, something was different. The screen zoomed in, showing the man's face in excruciating detail, and Emma realized with a start, it was her. She was the one bound to the chair. She was the one screaming. The final scream. Her heart raced as the realization hit her like a freight train. She wasn't just caught in this nightmare. She was part of it. She was trapped in the endless loop, her scream echoing through the void for eternity. There was no escape, no way out, and as the scream tore through her chest, Emma finally understood. She was the scream. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling as the realization set in. She wasn't merely trapped within the nightmare. She was the cause of it, the essence that had been called forth to fuel the terror. Her mind felt like it was about to shatter under the weight of this knowledge. Every part of her body screamed for relief, for escape, but the truth was undeniable. She was bound to this place, forever locked in an endless loop of suffering and fear. The images on the screen in front of her continued to flicker, the grotesque scene of her bound, broken self playing out over and over again. It was like watching someone else, someone who looked like her but wasn't quite. Every scream, every cry for help, reverberated through the air, surrounding her, suffocating her. As the image of her tortured self cried out once more, she turned away from the screen, her eyes stinging with tears that refused to fall. The walls around her seemed to close in, the cold air tightening its grip. It was as though the very room was alive, breathing, pulling her deeper into the abyss. No, this can't be real, Emma whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. She closed her eyes tightly, wishing for it all to end, for the nightmare to be over, for her mind to be freed from the torture. But when she opened her eyes again, she was still there, still trapped. The room around her warped once more. The walls dissolved into shadows, the floors twisting into spirals that seemed to spin endlessly. A low hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated deep within her bones. It was the sound of something ancient, something primordial, and Emma felt it inside her, as if it were calling to her, urging her to accept her fate. The figure appeared again, this time standing directly in front of her, its presence oppressive, suffocating. Its form was no longer obscured by darkness. It was completely clear now, and what it revealed made Emma's stomach churn. It was her mother, or at least it was a twisted, contorted version of her mother. The face was too pale, too gaunt, the eyes hollow and unblinking. The mouth stretched wide, revealing jagged teeth, stained with some dark substance that looked like blood. Emma. The voice was low, a rasping whisper, but it filled the air with a palpable force. You can't run from what you are. You've always known this. The scream was never just a sound. It was your destiny. Emma stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The pain that she had felt all those years ago, the constant, gnawing fear that had followed her like a shadow, the terror that had started when she was just a child, the feeling of being hunted, of being marked, suddenly made sense. The scream had always been hers, a part of her. She had been chosen, dragged into this curse, and now it was hers to carry forever. No, I don't believe it, Emma said, her voice shaking but defiant. I'm not part of this. I never asked for this. The figure, her mother's twisted reflection, smiled, but it wasn't a kind or loving smile. It was twisted, filled with a strange, malicious satisfaction. You never had a choice, the figure whispered. It's always been in your blood. It's always been who you are. And now, you'll scream for eternity, just as I did, just as Wilhelm did. The name hit Emma like a slap to the face. Wilhelm. The scream. It was all connected, like a terrible thread that wove through time and space, binding them all together in this cruel fate. She felt as though the floor beneath her was being ripped away, her mind reeling as the figure's words sank in. Why? Emma choked out. Why me? Why now? The figure laughed, the sound hollow and cruel, echoing through the warped space around them. Because you are the one who will carry the final scream. The scream that breaks the cycle. The scream that will never fade. It's your scream, Emma, and it always will be. Suddenly, the room seemed to collapse, folding in on itself like paper. Emma's world blurred, and she felt herself falling, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart around her. The air grew thick, heavy, as if she were being submerged in something cold and suffocating. She reached out, grabbing at the air around her, but there was nothing to hold onto. Nothing to stop her descent into the void. The scream, her scream, rose up in her throat, growing louder with each passing second, swelling until it filled her entire being. It was a cry of desperation, a sound of pure terror that tore through the darkness. She could feel it deep in her chest, the sound vibrating through her bones, through her very soul. And then, just as the darkness reached its peak, the scream broke free. For a moment, everything stopped. The hum of the air, the crushing weight of the shadows, the twisting world, they all fell silent. Emma was suspended in that moment, the sound of her scream echoing through the void, the endless space, and then nothing. She opened her eyes, and the world around her had shifted. She was no longer in the twisted room, no longer in the suffocating darkness. She was standing in a vast, empty expanse, the sky above her a swirl of dark clouds and swirling winds. The air was still, silent, but she could feel something. A presence, something ancient and primal, watching her. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since the scream, but she felt as though she had crossed some threshold, stepped into a place beyond the physical world. Her body ached, and her head throbbed with a dull, constant pain, but there was a strange sense of calm now. A stillness. And then, out of the silence, a voice broke through. "You are free," it said, though it sounded distant, almost ethereal. Emma looked around, searching for the source, but there was no one in sight. "Free," she whispered. "What does that mean? What have I done?" "You have broken the cycle," the voice explained. "The final scream has been heard, and it will not haunt you again. You are no longer bound by the curse." Emma's heart skipped a beat, but something inside her refused to believe it. The scream, her scream, had echoed throughout the very fabric of her existence. She had been marked by it, bound to it. Could it really be over? And yet, as she stood there in the eerie stillness, the weight of it all slowly began to lift. The darkness was fading, the torment of the past slipping away like sand through her fingers. She felt lighter, freer, as if the very essence of her being was being released from the grip of the curse. For the first time in years, Emma felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the nightmare was finally over.